how accurate do you think the Quran is, for example?
Well, I think the Quran has a number of problematic historical issues, the chief of which is that Surah 4:157 denies the historical crucifixion of Jesus.
Wes Huff was on the Piers Morgan show, and Piers Morgan presses him on Islam and the rise of it, and it's absolutely amazing. Wes Huff actually shows the crazy Islamic dilemma that causes Islam to fail and not be reliable. So let's get right into it. Shout out to Wesley Huff and Piers Morgan. This is absolutely amazing. Here we go.
As we approach Easter, why do you think Christianity is getting less popular as Islam is now the fastest growing religion in the world?
Yeah, I think there are a few kind of sociological factors that we can look at with that. I don't necessarily think that Islam is growing because of conversions. I think that Islam is outpacing us in terms of birth rate and immigration. So if we look at traditionally Christianized countries, the birth rates are lower. People in the West are having less children. And in fact, if you look at kind of the statistics of Christian growth, I think we're actually seeing a movement to the global south of Christian conversions, where in places like Asia and Africa, you're seeing a growth of Christianity and religious observance in that sense, whereas you see a lot of the importing of Islam into Western countries. And so I wouldn't go as far as saying that Islam is growing because lots of people are converting. I would actually say that largely we're just being outbred in terms of the growth rates with people having children and the amount of people who are coming into places like the UK, the United States, Europe, and Canada that come from majority Muslim countries.
But someone like the UK, for example, I mean, church going has been, pretty rapidly reducing, I'd say, in terms of the general population now for several decades. People just don't go to church like they used to. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that we saw a shift when it was much more culturally acceptable, whether you truly believed in, say, a convictional Christianity or not, in decades past. You would just go to church. That was definitely true here in Canada. We even had laws like the Lord's Day Act, which made it illegal to open a business on a Sunday. And so there was just more of a cultural zeitgeist for Christianity. And as that waned, I think the cultural zeitgeist, it became much more comfortable for people to then not go to church and attend. So I don't think we actually saw a great kind of influx of people leaving the church as much as the people who were convictional Christians continued to go to church, and people who were more cultural Christians or Christians out of convenience, because that was just what you did within the overall day-to-day of society, those people left. And so statistically, it looked like there were a lot of people leaving the church, when I don't necessarily think that was the case. I think the culture moved and everyone else just kind of moved with the culture, and where once it was acceptable and just kind of more of the norm to go to and attend a church on a Sunday, when it was no longer the norm, those people just followed the norm of the society. I actually think we're seeing somewhat of a resurgence in that Bible sales have skyrocketed in the last couple of years. I think we're seeing individuals kind of come into the limelight and are bringing a Christian message in a much more overt way where we didn't see before. People who are popular, if they're not Christian, are bringing kind of a spotlight on Christianity. People like Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan, who I think are much more sympathetic to Christianity. And so although I do think we've seen that cultural shift where it's just become less culturally acceptable to go to church, and so those people are no longer attending church, I actually think we are seeing, Pierce, kind of a grassroots movement that's very interesting in terms of people who might have been more interested in the new atheism 10 years ago, actually saying, I think there's something about this Christianity thing. And
yep, I 100% agree. Like, now the culture is shifting again. Even Alex O'Connor was saying, like, it used to be the new atheism in like the early 2000s that's the cool thing. They were like running the culture, and they had this idea, if you're smart and if you're in science, you don't believe in God, you're an atheist. And that's kind of what happened. Those were the cool people. But now in 2025, it's shifted again, and all like the popular people are at least Christian affirming. They love to talk about the Bible. They're at least not talking bad about it. They think it's interesting. Like Jordan Peterson, like they said, and Joe Rogan, they completely had this shift, and now it's almost like you're a based cool guy if you believe in God now.
Doing things like reading the Bible or attending a church on Sunday when they otherwise wouldn't have.
I mean, there's no doubt, for example, that President Donald Trump, his faith was massively cemented. I think he's been quite open about this, by surviving an assassin's bullet last summer. And he talked about how he started praying more and everything else. And that, he's got a massive following in America, obviously, the big MAGA movement. Do you think that's been partly one of the reasons why you're seeing a resurgence of interest in Christianity in America, sales of Bibles and so on, when the president is out there talking in the way that Trump has been doing?
I think that's a possibility. I think we're probably seeing a multivalent issue going on, in that I don't know if there's any kind of one factor. I think there are convening factors. I think we live in a very tumultuous world where we're sort of the onslaught and prevalence of just the information online is bringing attention to questions of meaning and purpose and morality. I think we're kind of coming to the end of our rope with some of the subjectivity of objective truth in this world. And I actually think that a lot of the seeds that were planted by the new atheists in the early 2000s ended up growing into trees that produced fruit that really didn't give any nourishment. And so I think people are seeing that, and we're seeing a resurgence at minimum of people who are becoming quote unquote spiritual but not religious, but also looking at what something like Christianity or organized religion has to offer and saying, I think there's something there that actually can ground me, that I can plant my feet firmly on, rather than kind of the planting my feet firmly in midair that atheism was offering. But even though it was giving me maybe some superficial solace, it didn't actually give me the ability to say that I had objective truth and meaning and value.
Yep, and that's tough. So now he's going to get into the Quran and the problems that arise with the Quran here. This is super interesting.
Blandish and a little bit more boisterous in the things.
The text of the Quran, like all religious texts, including the Bible, has been misused, misinterpreted, or accurately interpreted, depending on who you talk to. From a historian perspective, how accurate do you think the Quran is, for example?
Well, I think the Quran has a number of problematic historical issues, the chief of which is that Surah 4:157 denies the historical crucifixion of Jesus. And so there's ambiguity as to what's going on in that text when it says that Jesus was neither killed nor was he crucified. And I think that really paints the historical reliability of the Quran into a corner, in that, like I said before, Pierce, if there's one thing that even the most skeptical scholars historically will say, if they say we really can know not that much about Jesus of Nazareth, they will admit and say what we can know is that he did die under the reign of Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea at that time, that he was indeed crucified. And so I find that the Quran has a number of very problematic historical issues. And then ultimately, as a Christian, the Quran seems to talk about what I believe, talks about the Torah and the gospel multiple times, and seems to fundamentally not understand what the Torah and the gospel are.
Dang. Yeah, I think the biggest problem is it's not historically accurate. Even every skeptic, every atheist, every person mostly will acknowledge that Jesus did in fact die on the cross by the Romans. And Islam says, no, he didn't.
Particularly, I would highlight verses like chapter 5, verse 46 and 47, which has this chain of custody where it says that Allah sent, that God sent, following in the footsteps, Jesus, the son of Mary, to confirm the Torah, which came before him, and that he gave the gospel, which he, in the Quran, uses the same terminology for the revelation of the Quran, that it has guidance and light, and that the gospel preceded the Torah for instruction in righteousness. And then verse 47 of chapter 5 of the Quran actually addresses me as a Christian, it says, let the people of the gospel judge by what God has revealed therein, being the gospel. And whoever does not judge by what God has revealed, then it is he who's the defiantly disobedient. And so I find a problem with the Quran in that it confirms the Torah and the gospel, and it tells me as a Christian in chapter 5, verse 46 and 47, to judge by the gospel. However, Pierce, when I judge the Quran by the gospel, I find that the Quran does not understand what the gospel is or says. And ultimately, I would say if the Quran is true, and I need to take it seriously to not be one of the defiantly disobedient, as it says, and I judge the gospel by using the gospel, I judge the Quran, I find that the Quran is hugely problematic historically, but also in that it simply does not understand either what the Torah or the gospel are or what Christians actually believe.
Your Joe Rogan appearance blew up.
That's a big problem. He would have known that if he'd known anything about the Bible, the Old Testament or the New Testament, he would have known that it contradicts. Christians look at the Quran and say, no, it's not completely right. So now he's going to get into the part about Joe Rogan. I think this is interesting.
Line led to huge debate raging all over social media. What was that like for you? You know, you go on Rogan now, as Trump and others have found, it's a much bigger deal. Obviously, uncensored is right up there, but Joe is the king of the podcasters. What was your response to the reaction you got?
Yeah, I mean, I knew that there obviously were going to be a lot of eyeballs on me as a relatively insignificant Canadian historian. After that event, I mean, someone recently said to me that what Oprah was in decades past, Joe Rogan is today, and that the people who go on Joe Rogan really are the people who kind of get the attention in society, whereas in the past, the Dr. Phils and the Deepak Chopras of the world who would go on Oprah and then become somebody. Joe, as kind of, the individual who is exemplified of the cultural zeitgeist of the 2025, does that same kind of thing. And so I was at least to some degree aware, I need to brace myself for what's going to happen. But I have nothing but good things to say about Joe. I have nothing but good things to say about his team and the way that they have encouraged me following that. And, the brief and sporadic messages that Joe has sent me since going on his program, but that are just really encouraging and uplifting. And so I'm very thankful for that and the attention that it's drawn to my work historically and with the organization I work with Apologetics Canada. It's an interesting experience to gain that much attention in a very short period of time, as I'm sure you're aware of, Pierce, in terms of your own kind of the amount of eyeballs that are watching you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole new world for me. I've been doing full on YouTube now for like a year and a half, or whatever, and it is you suddenly become aware of how many different people around the world avidly consume this kind of thing, and also the debate that they start having amongst themselves through other social media about shows that appear on Joe Rogan, on Uncensored, whatever it may be. That's why it's always interesting, I think, for people like you who are clearly, very bona fide historians. I'm always curious take with your appearance on Joe, did you find that afterwards, with everyone debating stuff you'd said, did anything change your mind about anything? Did any of your opinions change because of reaction you had to a particular thing you said?
Not necessarily, although you become more acutely aware of how you should say things in public, and always the problem with generalizing, especially when we're talking about sometimes technical, historical, and academic issues, is that
like saying word for word. That's a whole thing that came from that video. Oh my goodness.
Going to say things imperfectly, and the internet is notorious for nitpicking and capitalizing on what you may or may not have said correctly. And so some of my colleagues in academia would have rathered me just sit across from Joe and read an academic paper, citations and all, and that would have cured all the issues, but it would have made for more of a boring podcast. And so, you just kind of you take those things, you eat the meat and you spit out the bones. My exposure and my experience after the Joe Rogan podcast, the positives have far outweighed any of the negatives, and I'm very appreciative of him and that and those kind of things. So, you're never going to say things perfectly. There are always going to be a better way to articulate yourself. But at the end of the day, own your mistakes and uh, be glad for what's happened, and I'm very grateful for what's transpired since appearing on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Well, that's super cool. So, guys, I encourage you all to go to Jesus today. Know that he loves you. He died on the cross for your sins so that you could be saved. We've all fallen short. We've all made mistakes. We've all are sinners. That's why we need a savior. That's why we need Jesus. So do that. Look to Jesus. He loves you so, so much. Thank you so much for watching and have an amazing day.